Well, friends, and of course, all my dear students and former students, I would like to begin by saying that, as all of you know, this is one of the toughest times that JNU and perhaps the country is also going through. I was rather worried when I read a report in today's newspaper which was talking about a book release function held yesterday for a book written by our former Home Minister and Finance Minister Chidambaram, which said that in his speech he noted that in the history of independent India, there are 3 moments where he has seen such polarization. And he said the partition, the Babri Masjid demolition and what happened around it, and he said now. I'm beginning with this to try and bring to you the significance of what is happening today. What is happening is not just about JNU, as I'm sure all of you are by now aware. It is about JNU, it is about Kanhaiya, it is about all our other students, it's about Anirban, it's about Umar, and yet it's much, much bigger than that. And I think increasingly we all have to get a sense of what we are fighting for. What is it that we are standing up for, and how important it is that we stand up and continue to stand for it. Because I think JNU has been chosen for this attack because precisely of its significance and the symbolism that JNU embodies. And I think the powers that be feel that if they can cow us down, if they can make us shut up, if they can scare the JNU students, then they won the battle. They don't have to go to every university and every town in the country to tell them, don't speak against us and our ideology. Don't speak against their idea of India. The message will go loud and clear. People will say, if JNU couldn't stand up to it, if JNU with its renowned faculty couldn't stand up to it, if JNU with its wonderful students couldn't stand up to it, with all the support that it can get internationally and nationally, from the media, from every sector that we are getting, from Parliament, if we can't stand up to it, then the battle is really won. So I think the significance of this battle for all of us, we are fighting for the nation. And we are lucky in a way that we are the ones who've been chosen for this. Because we do have the capacity to fight. In difficult times like this, it is privileged places like JNU, and I don't mean privileged in the ordinary sense of the term that we have more money or we have more facilities. I mean privileged because of the education that we get over here. Privileged because of the quality of the faculty and the students. Privileged because of our tradition, which has been established by the founders of this university, which have given us this very solid grounding. So I think it is very important that each one of us understand the significance and therefore bring to our struggle that seriousness and gravitas, sobriety, and sense of purpose. I also want to use this opportunity to say that the slogans which we are putting out and the principles which we are talking about that we embody, debate, discussion, difference, we are telling the world every day, we are not anti-national. In fact, we are nation builders. We are telling the world every day that we believe in debate and in respecting difference. We believe in discussion. We believe in actually sorting out all our problems through our own institutional mechanisms. We are fighting for our autonomy. We are criticizing those in our administration who've been compromising our autonomy. But that puts a very great responsibility on us, that we do actually live these principles. We also need to look inwards. Where we have been intolerant, we need to ask ourselves, do we need to change? Do we need to become also more accommodative of difference? Do we need to engage in more debate and discussion and dialogue rather than just tolerate difference? These are some of the things I'd like to talk to you about today, linking it with the tradition of the Indian national movement. As you know, I'm not a theoretician, I'm not an ideologue, I am an ordinary historian, and our craft is a very mundane craft. We wade through very boring archives and we try to make sense of that, and we try and bring you some of the excitement of that past. So what I'm going to do really is tell you some stories, especially about those parts of our past and of the past of our long battle for freedom, which are not so well known. So there may be times where you feel why do we need to go back into these old stories? Admiral Ramdas just said, we are in the 21st century. Nationalism is an idea that came up in the 17th century. Forget it. It's a very nice, it's a nice talking point, but it is actually too serious. Nationalism and its power, we are seeing it around us. How it's being misused, how it's being flung in our face, how in less than 2 weeks, the image of this university has been changed in the country. You all know when you go out, what happens when auto drivers tell you, do you want to go to Pakistan? No? By the way, my answer to that is, why should I want to go to Pakistan when you're making Pakistan here? I need not go across the border very soon. But I think that we need to take the idea of nationalism seriously, understand its resonance among the people, and try and appropriate to ourselves what I have called, recently also I wrote about it, that there is a progressive nationalism, there is a revolutionary nationalism, and there is a regressive and a jingoistic nationalism. It's the jingoistic, aggressive nationalism which is calling us anti-nationalists. And we are going to return that. We are going to reply to that by telling people, by telling our countrymen, we stand for the humane, compassionate, pro-people, revolutionary nationalism which our freedom struggle has given us. It's that tradition which we are going to assert and throw in the face of those who are challenging our nationalism. I'll begin by just a few general observations about the legacy of the freedom struggle, but for my talk today, I have chose to concentrate on the issue of civil liberties, because I think the heart of the debate, or rather the attack on us today, and especially on our students, is the issue of civil liberties. How every channel, every discussion, everywhere you go, they say, but aren't there limits that have to be placed on civil liberties? Is there no restriction on freedom of speech? What are those limits? What are those restrictions? These are not absolutes. These are not things which you can answer with a yes or a no. And I think we need to look back at our own tradition and see how the struggle that brought this country into being, how did they address these issues? What was the nation they envisioned? And how did they see to it through their own practice and their own struggle that these ideas were embodied and went deep into Indian society? But just a little caveat before I get on to civil liberties, which is to say that the legacy of the freedom struggle in my opinion, is many-fold, but the crucial elements in that are a commitment to secularism, a commitment to democracy and civil liberties. Civil liberties are part of, you cannot have one without the other. But I'm not going to be talking about democracy today. I'll focus on civil liberties. There is the tradition of an egalitarian social and economic order, or a pro-poor orientation. And there is the tradition or the legacy of sovereignty and independence. These are some of the crucial legacies that we have from our freedom struggle, which are embodied in our constitution. This constitution was not a gift of the British. Democracy was not a gift of the British. We fought for it every inch of the way. As early as 1895, Lokmanya Tilak had published a Constitution of India bill in which he had asked for universal adult suffrage, both men and women, no property qualification, no educational qualification, as early as 1895. In Britain, women got the vote after the First World War. In India, of course, as we know, we got it in the Constitution. Right from 1895, I mean, I gave you the example of 1895, but from much before that, the struggle for what finally went into the Constitution of India had been going on. So the Constitution also was not a one-shot affair. In fact, much of what the Constitution actually was finally had been worked out through the early, at least 50, in the previous 50 years before that, through debate, discussion, struggle, and long deliberations between different streams of the Indian national movement. Coming to civil liberties, I'd like to begin by saying, and this should strengthen all of us, that this tradition actually goes back at least to Ram Mohan Roy. And I'm talking about 192 years ago. So when you're fighting this battle for civil liberties, don't feel weak. You have that whole tradition and that whole legacy behind you. I don't know what's going to happen to the light, but to the extent I can, I do want to share some very interesting quotes with you. This is in the year 1824. Raja Ram Mohan Roy protested against a regulation restricting freedom of the press. The regulation did not come before that because there was no press. So as soon as the modern press started to emerge, the regulation started to emerge. He wrote in a memorandum to the Supreme Court, "Every good ruler will be anxious to afford every individual the readiest means of bringing to his notice whatever may require his interference. To achieve this important object, the unrestricted liberty of publication," please note the words, "the unrestricted liberty of publication is the only effectual means that can be employed." So this goes back to the early 19th century. Even before the establishment of the Indian National Congress in 1885, which we usually take as the beginning of the modern national movement, right from the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, the demand for civil liberties, and particularly freedom of the press, was an invariant part of the demands of the early nationalists. In fact, I would say that Indian nationalism actually began in the Indian language press. The earliest manifestations of Indian nationalism and the earliest manifestation of identifying with the peasant, which becomes a very interesting and important feature of Indian nationalism, begins in the 1860s. It is Deenbandhu Mitra who writes Neel Darpan in the early 1860s. It's a play about the Indigo Revolt. That is as early as the 1860s, just a few years after the revolt of 1857. And beginning with that, this goes on strengthening to the point that in 1878, the British had to pass the Vernacular Press Act, Why did they pass a Vernacular Press Act to restrict the freedom of the Indian language press, not the English language press? Because the Indian language press was far more radical and revolutionary than the English language press. So they brought in a bill, they passed the act which severely restricted the liberty of the Indian language press. And I'll come back in and there was a huge agitation by nationalists and the nationalist press against this act. I'll come back to this story a little later. All early nationalist leaders made maintenance of civil liberties and their extension an integral part of the national movement. They fought against every infringement of the freedom of the press and speech and opposed every attempt to curtail them. I will try and give you a few examples. In fact, it was said at that time that the press played the role of the institutional opposition to the government. In the absence of democracy, it was the Indian press which fought for its freedom every day, which performed this task. The motto of the press was called, I quote, 3 words: oppose, oppose, oppose. And please remember, I'm talking before even the establishment of the Indian National Congress. Every act of the government was subjected to sharp criticism. Lord Dufferin, who was the Viceroy, in March 1886, barely 3 months after the formation of the Indian National Congress, said, and I quote, "Day after day, hundreds of sharp-witted babus pour forth their indignation against their English oppressors in very pungent and effective diatribe." Will anybody say that of our press today? He continued 2 months later, I quote again, "In this way, there can be no doubt that there is generated in the minds of those who read these papers a sincere conviction that we are all of us the enemies of mankind in general and of India in particular." That was the tone of the press even before officially the organization that led the Indian national movement was founded. However, as we all know now very well, JNU perhaps the most well-informed place about Section 124A. I'm sure all of you dream about it in your sleep, have it for breakfast, rehearse it at lunch, you know. Anyway, Section 124A had been brought on to the Indian Penal Code in 1870. So the press, people who were writing in this press, to preach disloyalty was no easy task, because this section could be used against them. The punishment could go up to transportation for life. That was the punishment. Therefore, journalists of that time, and by the way, I should do a little caveat here. The Indian press at this time and the journalists who were there were all nationalists, all or most of them. I don't mean there was a bit of a pro-British press as well. But the nationalist press was all established by very middle-class people who usually put all their life savings and their wives' jewelry, which they sold happily, and set up this press. Most of them were ruined. Their families suffered a lot. It was not big business houses that set up these newspapers. Therefore, journalists perfected a variety of subterfuges. How to work around this Section 124A. They prefaced their vitriolic writings with effusive professions of loyalty to the government and the Queen. So before the abuses, it was all presaged by loud professions of loyalty. Some historians have taken that seriously and said the moderates were loyal. Or they published extracts from radical socialist and socialist British newspapers often without giving the quotation marks and the source, to fool the bureaucracy into contemplating action, which of course the bureaucracy had to give up once they discovered the source. They would say, we are just repeating what came out in the London Times or some such newspaper. And since they hadn't prosecuted those, they couldn't very well start prosecuting them here. This was a very, very favorite game that was played. Apart from everything else, it made the bureaucracy look very foolish. Another very favorite strategy was that an article in a British newspaper, which was, let's say, sympathetic about terrorist activities against Tsarist Russia, would be republished as a means of drawing attention to the Indian revolutionaries' activity without ever naming the Indian revolutionaries. And you could not be accused of sympathy for them because, again, you were repeating a British newspaper which was talking about Tsarist Russia and not about India. I could go on telling you stories of this kind. Tilak particularly had perfected this particular art and had a lot of fun at the expense of the police and the bureaucracy through these kinds of stratagems. In fact, the first big mass demonstration in the form of a huge public meeting was organized in Calcutta in the town hall on the issue of civil liberties. So modern mass politics in India begins with defense of civil liberties. To oppose the Vernacular Press Act, which I already mentioned to you, passed in 1878 to gag the Indian language press. In fact, the protests were so powerful that the Viceroy, Lord Ripon, who followed Lytton, who had passed this act, actually repealed this act in 1881. Not a small victory by any means. Surendranath Banerjee, one of the founders of Indian nationalism, his book, by the way, in a way explained how Indian national movement conceived of nationalism. He wrote an autobiography which he titled A Nation in the Making. That was the conception of India. Not a pre-made, preordained nation from, built, which originated in the deep past and infallible, but a nation that had to be made. A nation can also be unmade. Surendranath Banerjee, one of the founders of Indian nationalism, I said, was the first to go to jail for his journalistic writings. In an editorial in the newspaper Bengali, that was the name of his newspaper, on 2nd April 1883, he criticized in sharp terms the judgment of the Calcutta High Court. He was sent to jail for 2 months for contempt of court. Vigorous protests followed. There was a hartal, total hartal in the Indian part of Calcutta. Students demonstrated outside the court. They threw stones at the police and smashed the windows of the court. One of the rowdy young men was Ashutosh Mukherjee, who later became the famous Vice-Chancellor of Calcutta University. Who knows who will become Vice-Chancellors a few years down the line? Life has a way of turning everything around. Protests spread to many cities in Bengal and elsewhere. Lahore, Amritsar, Agra, Faizabad, Pune, all across North India. The first open-air mass meetings were held in Calcutta. This tradition of open-air mass meetings, which is what you are doing today, and this which became the staple of the Indian national movement, if any particular form is identified with India's freedom struggle, it is the open-air mass meetings, mammoth meetings. And this tradition started with the protests against Surendranath Banerjee's arrest in 1883. I'm sure by now you've all heard of Tilak, who went to jail, charged under Section 124A of the Indian Penal Code on the charge of sedition. Why was he sent to jail on the charge of sedition? Because he published in his newspaper, the Kesari, which was a Marathi language newspaper. In English, he published the Maratha. 15th June 1897, he published a poem titled Shivaji's Utterances, and also a copy of a speech which he had given at the Shivaji festival. He was tried by Justice Strachey and a jury of 6 Europeans and 3 Indians. The verdict was all 6 Europeans for the sentence and all 3 Indians against. A barbarous sentence of 18 months rigorous imprisonment was passed, and this when Tilak was a member of the Bombay Presidency Legislative Council. The reaction was instantaneous. Again, do remember, this is still before the Swadeshi movement, when the real mass movement really begins. So I'm deliberately telling you the story of the pre-mass movement phase to let you know how deep this tradition is. Widespread countrywide protests followed against this attack on civil liberties. Who led these protests? The moderates. Who was Tilak? An extremist. So his political rivals or his political opponents were the ones who organized and led the protests against his arrest. Why? Because they believed that civil liberties were super important. And you had to defend your opponent if that opponent was attacked on the ground of suppression of civil liberties. Newspapers came out with black borders. I could go on, but finally, at the Indian National Congress, which was held, a session that was held in December that year, Surendranath Banerjee summed up the mood of the people. I quote, "A whole nation," he said, "is in tears." That was the reaction to Tilak's imprisonment for publishing those articles in his newspaper. Once again, on 24th June 1908, Tilak was arrested and tried for sedition, again under the same section. Now for having published a series of articles called On the Arrival of the Bomb. In these articles, while criticizing and condemning the use of violence and the use of the bomb, this is, as you know, 1908, within the Swadeshi movement, there was a strand which we call revolutionary terrorism, which had now started using bombs and violence against individual officers, etc. So while condemning the violence, his whole article was about why this is happening, and he lays the blame squarely at the door of the British, saying, because you do not permit dissent, because you are not giving us our freedom, you are pushing our youth into these channels. For writing these articles, even though he condemned the violence, he was then charged again under this act, under this section. A few days before he was arrested, he was warned by a friendly police officer of the impending action. He laughed and said, I quote, "You will all, I'm sure, relate to this. The government has converted the entire nation into a prison, and we are all prisoners. Going to prison only means that from a big cell, one is confined. That was happening earlier was not possible. So that one incarceration had a very profound impact on the national movement as a whole. Public reaction to Tilak's arrest and sentence was stupendous. That's the only word I can use. Workers of textile mills and railway workshops in Bombay went on a strike for 6 days. And this is a complete political strike. There were hardly any trade unions at that time. It was a complete spontaneous action by the working class. Markets remained closed for a week. So all sections of society, all over India, there were protests. To force the workers in Bombay back to work, the police was called, they failed. The army was then called out, and 16 workers died in that clash. Lenin, hearing about this, hailed this as the entry of the Indian working class on the political stage. And he thereby called Tilak a revolutionary. Echoes of Tilak's trial were heard in 1922 when Gandhiji was tried for the same offense of sedition under the same section 124A. So there's a very long and glorious tradition of those who've been tried under this. This was, as you know, after the non-cooperation movement had ended. The government did not have the courage to arrest him while the movement was on, but the moment it ended, they picked him up and charged him for what? After here was a leader who had led the biggest mass movement against the British possible till now, where millions had participated, lakhs had gone to jail, but they charged him for sedition for writing articles in Young India. Such is the beauty of government. Anyway, the judge told him his offense was the same as that of Lokmanya Tilak, and therefore he was going to give him the same sentence of 6 years. Gandhiji replied, "Since you have done me the honor of recalling the trial of the late Lokmanya, I just want to say that I consider it to be the proudest privilege and honor to be associated with his name." Okay. The one thing I want to point out, the very remarkable and interesting difference between 1908 and 1922 when Gandhiji is charged, shows you the long path the national movement had crossed in this period, and how Gandhian politics brought a completely new idiom, not just idiom, it brought a completely new framework into Indian nationalism. Even the great Tilak, courageous, brave, not afraid of the British, willing to go to jail, defended himself against the charge of sedition. Gandhiji said, "I plead guilty to the charge of sedition." This was the territory that the movement had crossed till then, because Gandhiji said, "Yes, indeed, this is a satanic government and I'm proud to oppose it." So they did not resist. These became acts of civil disobedience, where you proudly and openly defied laws that you thought were unjust and took the punishment for them. Coming to Gandhiji, I would like to share with you a couple of, I think, very fine quotations. As we all know, that in his work and in his actual practice in the freedom struggle, Gandhiji showed a tremendous commitment to the values of democracy, civil liberties, dialogue, including dialogue with his opponents, His whole ethic of politics was that you do not even leave your opponent out of a dialogue. But still, I think it's important that we also get a flavor of the beautiful language in which he could express his ideas. I'm quoting from a statement, an article he wrote in Young India in 1922, in January at the height of the non-cooperation movement. Even at the height of the non-cooperation movement, he's telling people the most important thing is civil liberties. I quote, "We must first make good the right of free speech and free association before we can make any further progress towards our goal. We must defend these elementary rights with our lives." That's how important the struggle for civil liberties is, that you must be willing to even sacrifice your life for it. I quote from another article which he wrote soon after, "Liberty of speech means that it is unassailed even when the speech hurts. Liberty of the press can be said to be truly respected only when the press can comment in the severest terms upon and even misrepresent matters. Freedom of association is truly respected when assemblies of people can discuss even revolutionary projects." The only line that he drew was that of non-violence, as will become clear in the next quotation that I read to you. I quote again, "Civil liberty, consistent with the observance of non-violence, is the first step towards Swaraj. It is the breath of political and social life. It is the foundation of freedom. There is no room here for dilution or compromise. It is the water of life." So civil liberties, there are no limits. It's the water of life, he says. The imagery of water, I think, is very significant. Water of life, that is, there is no life without water, and civil liberty is like water, but it also can't be diluted. You can't say, "I give you this freedom, but I put restraints on it, but I put limits on it." In fact, the Supreme Court also, in the way it has defined Section 124A and what constitutes it, has very clearly put in non-violence or violence. That is, as long as you remain within those limits, you cannot be accused of sedition, even if you are discussing a revolutionary project. So I think this is something that becomes very clear from what is the understanding of the notion, any notion of limits. Jawaharlal Nehru was perhaps the most vociferous believer of civil liberties. I quote from him, this is 1936, he said, "If civil liberties are suppressed, a nation loses all vitality and becomes impotent for anything substantial. The freedom of the press does not consist in our permitting such things as we like to appear." How is that freedom? "Even a tyrant is agreeable to this kind of freedom. Civil liberty and freedom of the press consist in our permitting what we do not like, in our putting up with criticisms of ourselves, in our allowing public expression of views which seem to us even to be injurious to our cause itself." That's why I said, look within, introspect. Do we match up to these standards of what is really civil liberties? Nehru attached as much importance to civil liberties as he did to economic equality and socialism. He drafted the Karachi resolution of the Indian National Congress, which I'm sure all of you know about. It was like the charter of the Congress. It was the precursor to the Constitution of India. in 1931, which guaranteed freedom of expression and freedom of association. I'm sure you've all heard of the People's Union for Civil Liberties and etc., PUDR and PUCR, etc. Well, the man whose statue is there and has become now such a potent symbol, I'm not sure they planned it that way. He was the one who was the strongest force behind founding the Indian Civil Liberties Union in 1936 as a non-party, non-sectarian organization. As Prime Minister, we know, he upheld these freedoms consistently. If I start talking about that story, we'll be sitting up here the whole night. I want to give you a couple of examples of defense of civil liberties, not just statements of faith in civil liberties, but actually living out these conceptions which I've just talked about. That is defending people with whom you do not agree, defending your opponents, defending people with whom you have maybe even sharp differences. The first example I want to share with you is from 1929. You've all heard perhaps of the Meerut conspiracy case. In March 1929, the British government, very worried that left and communist activities were increasing in India, they were becoming powerful in the working class, Girni Kamgar Union in Bombay, Workers and Peasants Parties, Kirti Kisan Party in Punjab, Kisan Mazdoor Party in Bengal, there was a flourishing of left-wing activity and organizations in India, especially between 1927 and 29. Subhash Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru had both committed themselves to socialism. They had formed the youth leagues. So this was a period when the government was becoming for the first time, becoming afraid of left-wing activity. So what they did was that they thought they will divide the left. So what they did was, very interesting, very contemporary resonances. They picked up those whom they thought represented the extreme wing of the left, hoping thereby to divide the left and the national movement. So this is, they picked up 32 people who were trade union leaders, political leaders, including 3 British communists who had come to India to help in the organization of the trade union movement. They were put up for trial at Meerut, and very soon the Meerut conspiracy case became a national cause. They thought they would isolate them, suppress them, convict them and send them for long terms to jail and thereby finish the movement. Instead, what happened was Jawaharlal Nehru, M.A. Ansari and M.C. Chagla, they are the ones who took up their defense. So they became their lawyers. They said, we will defend the communists. Gandhiji himself, I wonder how many of you know this, visited the Meerut prisoners in jail to show solidarity with them. And lest I forget, Jawaharlal Nehru had visited Bhagat Singh and his comrades in jail to show solidarity with them. Speeches of defense made by them in the court were carried in major nationalist newspapers. And this was how, for the first time, in fact, ordinary Indians, lakhs of Indians, became familiar with communist ideas. Because they came to the court and in their defense they talked about what their ideals were. Just like our police is learning about subaltern studies and Indian history and, getting very educated in the process. I hope they don't apply for admission. Though we welcome genuine students no matter from where they come. In the CHS, we had a Marine, an actual US Marine as our student 3 or 4 years ago, and he was a brilliant student. I want to give you another example of how this idea of, as I said, not just tolerating difference, not just accommodating difference, but actually encouraging it, and when necessary, protecting. This is, in my opinion, a wonderful example of this tradition of the national movement and exemplified by Gandhiji himself at the highest level. You've all heard of the Quit India movement, 1942. Many of you would also know that this was during the Second World War. All public assemblies, etc. were banned, and yet the Congress, in its session, which was held in Bombay, to take the decision about the Quit India movement, it held the AICC meeting in an open Maidan. It's called the Gowalia Tank. Those of you who know Bombay probably recognize it. It's right in the heart of the city. So this was supposed to be a meeting of the All India Congress Committee, which consisted of maybe about 250 or 300 people. But actually there were thousands of people that turned up who were there despite the ban on assemblies. This was the mood, a fiery mood. People were very angry against the British, what was happening during the war years. And this was a day before the entire leadership of the movement is picked up and thrown into jail, and then the movement breaks out. What is called the revolution of 1942 breaks out. This is one day before that. I'm sure many of you, and probably all of you also know, that Indian communists were opposed to the Quit India movement. Their line was that of people's war. Their understanding was that this is a war against fascism. Soviet Union is on the side of the Allies, and we must support that war. There were 3 communist members of the All India Congress Committee. I hope you all know that communists, socialists were never banned from the Indian National Congress. They went right up till the All India Congress Committee. So there were 3 communist members of the AICC who came to the meeting. Not only they came to the meeting, when the main resolution, which was in favor of Quit India, that we would now launch a movement where Gandhiji made his famous do or die speech, they pressed amendments to that resolution and in fact asked for a division. And they voted against the Quit India resolution. Try and imagine that atmosphere. You're not even 1,000 people here. This was at least 10, 15,000 people, all in favor of the movement. 3 communists get up, oppose it. In that fervor, what could have happened? What does Gandhiji do? When after they oppose the resolution, he gets up and says, I want to congratulate my communist friends for what they have done. I'm quoting Gandhiji now. He says, in doing so, he said, they had nothing to be ashamed of. For the last 20 years, we have tried to learn not to lose courage, even when we are in a hopeless minority, and are laughed at. We have learned to hold on to our beliefs in the confidence that we are in the right. It behoves us to cultivate this courage of conviction, for it ennobles man and raises his moral stature. I was, therefore, glad to see that these friends had imbibed the principle which I have tried to follow for the last 50 years or more. What was Gandhiji doing by this statement? He was not only establishing the right to dissent, he was also providing a protective cover. in this situation of mass enthusiasm for Quit India. As I said, these three communists in a large crowd of enthusiastic revolutionaries. Imagine three people turning up here just now and saying they oppose everything that's going on. Not going to be a very easy situation for them, right? So imagine what I'm talking about. But this is how the best of our national leadership and Gandhiji himself inculcated in the Indian people the notion of democracy. It is not just about parliamentary system of government. It is not just about elections. As Nehru said, democracy in the final analysis is about dialogue. It's about whether you're willing to listen to your opponent or not. Are you willing to give your opponent the same space that you demand for yourself? I've carried on for a long time. I'd like to end by saying, I think that particularly from Gandhiji, as I said, we get many examples of actually practicing democracy, I think, and respect for difference in its most extreme form. He taught Indian people not to attack the enemy, attack the system. We are fighting not against the British people, not even against the British officials. We are fighting against British imperialism. At the height of the Quit India movement 1942, and I'm telling you this from personal example, we interviewed a lady who was then a young woman who later spent her whole life as a Gandhian. She was there in Bombay where there was frenzy. There was a procession being taken out and a British soldier was hurt because somebody threw something at this British soldier. The processionist stopped their procession, took the soldier to their home, treated him, gave him a glass of water, and he was astounded and said, "What is this?" They said, "No, this is our nationalism." And I can tell you hundreds of stories of this kind, not one. To the extent to which dialogue, and that is why I think our tradition in this country is so powerful, and I'm not afraid that it can be easily snuffed out. See the response to you. See the response to JNU. Have you gone and mobilized? How much mobilization have you done? There is a spontaneous reform because this is inside people. People do not like civil liberties to be suppressed. They don't like democratic principles to be suppressed. They don't like an aggressive nationalism to be flung at them as the genuine Indian nationalism. So this tradition is very deep, but we have to continue to fight for it. We can't be sanguine, but there's a lot of it there which will come to our aid if we have the courage to stand up. Gandhiji, at the height of when he emerged as the leader of the national movement during the non-cooperation movement, there were these revolutionaries whose politics in some ways was the exact opposite. They believed not just in violence, they believed in targeting individuals, targeted terrorist violence, bombs, shootings, etc. He called them for a dialogue. What are we saying in JNU? Dialogue with those who don't agree with us. Dialogue with those who are even going outside the pale of what we may think is correct or non-correct. He called them for a dialogue. They had long discussions. Believe it or not. He said to them, "I don't know whether my methods in the long run will prove to be the right ones or yours. But in order for me to experiment and try out my method of non-violence, if at the same time violent incidents happen, my method will not get a chance to be really tried out. So I ask you to suspend your politics for the period of this movement, the non-cooperation movement. Give me a chance to try my methods. If I fail, you take forward your methods." And would you believe it, they did. These were young people. completely believing in the opposite, and yet they agreed. So this was the level of dialogue that existed between opposing political strands within our freedom struggle, which is why we won the battle for freedom. Because people differed but worked together. Communists went in and out of the Indian national movement. Sometimes they had one theory, sometimes they had another. But they worked. They were in the peasant movements, they were in the workers' movement, they were in the women's movement, they were in the civil disobedience movements, the satyagraha movements. And the politics which they evolved was a politics in which their aim also was to bring the masses, the peasants and the workers into the freedom struggle. Of course, there were lots of differences. Nobody had perhaps greater differences than Nehru and Gandhi amongst themselves. Do please read Nehru's autobiography. Half the book is a criticism of Gandhiji. Gandhiji's reaction was, the more you criticize me, my love for you grows. What was poor Nehru to do with an opponent like that, who could disarm him always, who refused to get annoyed or disturbed by anything he said, and tried in fact to absorb and learn and continued to change. Tanika Sarkar the other day had talked here about Gandhiji. Perhaps my interpretation would be a little different, but I think the crucial point is that he was constantly evolving and changing in a radical direction, absorbing from other strands, even at that late age. I'll end by saying, how many people could have the courage that Mahatma Gandhi showed? What was exemplified in the last year before his assassination. He went to Noakhali on the 4th of November, 1946, when he heard that there was communal violence that had erupted over there. This was an area where there was a Muslim majority, not sympathetic, they were not for him, the government was not for him. And yet he decided, if these are my people and I'm saying this is my nation, I have to try and talk to them. I can't not talk to them. I can't just condemn them as communalists or whoever. So he went there and he stayed there for 4 months in one of the remotest districts of India. He didn't even come back to any town. He walked through village parts, dense jungle area, this Noakhali. When people threw excreta in his path, he took off his sandals. His very rough wooden sandals which he used to wear. He says, do what you can. Torture me more. Crucify my flesh more. Something must be wrong with me that my people are behaving like this, that I cannot communicate with them. And after some time, people did start listening. Every evening he would have an open prayer meeting, which he called prayer meeting, where anybody could come. We have examples of his prayer meetings in Bengal in 1946 in remote areas where 2 lakh people would turn up for his evening prayer meeting. This is in the days of communal, height of communal antagonisms. And yet he insisted that dialogue must happen. On the 15th of August 1947, where was he? He was not in Delhi celebrating independence. But that is not because he was not proud of Indian independence. Some people interpret it like that. But he saw his task as being where the toughest situations were. Surawardi asked him to stay on in Calcutta because Surawardi feared that on 15th of August, Calcutta will go to India and their government will come to an end. And Hindus will take revenge for the Calcutta killings of August 1946. I need you, Gandhiji, to stay here with me. And Gandhiji said to Surawardi, I will, provided you and I sleep under the same roof. You stay with me, we'll stay together. On the 15th of August 1947, he walked in the streets of Calcutta hand in hand with his opponent, Surawardi. They had nothing in common. But he would dialogue, not only dialogue, do much more. That is the tradition which we have, and which we have to fight for, to save, to keep up, and take forward. Thank you.